Margaret and Richard Calloway had spent nearly 4 decades together, bound by love, routine, and the quiet familiarity that only years of marriage could bring. Their life in the picturesque town of Hartford, Connecticut, was one many envied. A beautiful colonial-style home, 2 grown children who adored them, and a reputation as a couple who had truly withstood the test of time. Margaret, 63, was the heart of the household. A former schoolteacher, she had dedicated her later years to caring for their home and maintaining the warmth that made their house feel like more than just walls and a roof. She took pride in her role as a wife and mother, always ensuring that Richard, now 65 and a retired architect, came home to a warm meal and an open ear for his daily musings. Richard was the definition of a devoted husband, at least that's what everyone believed. He was charming, intelligent, and always spoke highly of his wife. Friends and neighbors often admired the way he still pulled out chairs for Margaret at dinner parties or brought her fresh flowers just because. They had been through everything together: job promotions and layoffs, the trials of parenthood, and the quiet loneliness that followed when their children moved away. But beneath the perfect exterior, Margaret had begun to notice small shifts. Richard had become more distant in the past few years. His affectionate gestures still existed but felt more like habits rather than sincere acts of love. There were unexplained late nights at his office, a phone he never left unattended, and a strange coldness that had settled into their once effortless conversations. Margaret dismissed these thoughts at first. After 38 years, isn't it natural for things to change? She told herself. Marriage was about trust, and she had never had reason to doubt Richard before. She reminded herself of their history, their love, and the life they had built together. But deep inside, an unsettling feeling gnawed at her. A feeling that, soon enough, she would no longer be able to ignore. The morning of February 14th, a day meant for love and celebration, started like any other for Margaret Calloway. She woke up early, prepared Richard's coffee just the way he liked it, and set out to make breakfast. But as she moved around the kitchen, something felt off. A dull headache throbbed at her temples, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the counter for balance, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to will the sensation away. Then, a sharp pain, unlike anything she had ever felt before, exploded in her head. Her vision blurred, the room spun, and before she could cry out for help, her body collapsed onto the cold tile floor. Richard found her minutes later. He had heard the thud from upstairs and rushed down, his heart pounding. "Margaret!" He crouched beside her, shaking her limp body. "Margaret, can you hear me?" Her face was slack, her breathing shallow. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The paramedics arrived swiftly, their movements efficient but urgent. They checked her vitals, lifted her onto a stretcher, and whisked her away to Hartford Memorial Hospital. Richard followed in his car, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Hours later, as Richard paced in the sterile waiting room, a doctor approached him. His face was solemn, his tone clinical. "Mr. Calloway, your wife has suffered a severe stroke. The damage is extensive, and she has slipped into a coma." Richard's breath caught in his throat. "A coma? How long? How long will she be like this?" The doctor hesitated. "It's hard to say. Some patients wake up in weeks, months, others never regain consciousness." The weight of those words crushed him. He had walked into the hospital with a wife, and now, she was frozen in time, trapped in a world he couldn't reach. The doctors stabilized Margaret, transferring her to a private room. Machines hummed around her, wires snaking from her body, monitoring her every function. She looked peaceful, as if merely sleeping. But she wasn't. And Richard Calloway, devoted husband, loving partner, was about to prove that his loyalty had its limits. The first few weeks after Margaret's stroke were the hardest. Richard spent hours by her bedside, holding her hand, whispering to her, hoping, praying for any sign that she could hear him. But Margaret remained still, her body betraying her, her mind locked away in a place no one could reach. The doctors encouraged him to take breaks, to go home and rest, but home felt empty without Margaret. Their bed was too big, their house too quiet. He had spent nearly 4 decades as a husband. What was he supposed to do now? That was when he met Linda Preston. Linda was one of the senior nurses assigned to Margaret's care. At 58, she was experienced, professional, and deeply compassionate. She had seen cases like Margaret's before, devoted spouses sitting vigil beside their loved ones, slowly breaking under the weight of their grief. At first, their interactions were brief. Linda would check Margaret's vitals, offer Richard a cup of coffee, and reassure him that they were doing everything they could. But as days turned to weeks, Richard found himself lingering in the hospital more than he needed to. Linda was kind. She listened. She understood his pain in a way that no one else seemed to. Then, one evening, everything changed. Richard had stayed late at the hospital, watching Margaret's motionless body, feeling more alone than ever. Linda sat beside him, offering quiet support. One moment, they were talking about Margaret's condition. The next, Richard broke down, his carefully maintained composure crumbling. Linda placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to go through this alone," she whispered. And for the first time in months, Richard didn't feel alone. Their relationship escalated quickly. At first, it was just late-night conversations in the hospital cafeteria, then a few dinners outside the hospital. Richard told himself that it was just friendship, that he needed someone to talk to, someone who understood his pain. But loneliness had a way of making people reckless. One evening, after a particularly emotional day at the hospital, Linda invited him over to her place. The invitation was innocent enough. Dinner, a glass of wine. But the moment Richard walked through her door, they both knew where the night was heading. The first kiss was hesitant, almost guilty. The second was desperate, filled with months of longing and suppressed desire. Richard told himself it was just a moment of weakness. But it wasn't just one moment. It became many. Soon, he wasn't just visiting Margaret out of obligation, he was visiting Linda out of need. He convinced himself that Margaret would never wake up. The doctors had said the damage was extensive, that there was little hope. What harm was there in moving on? What Richard didn't know was that Margaret would wake up. And when she did, she would uncover every betrayal, every lie, and she would make him pay. The world was dark. For what felt like an eternity, Margaret Calloway floated in an abyss of silence, trapped between life and death. Voices would come and go, distant echoes she couldn't grasp. Sometimes, she thought she heard Richard's voice. Other times, there were whispers, unfamiliar but strangely intimate. Then, one evening, something shifted. A faint beeping sound became sharper. A weight pressed against her chest. A dull ache settled into her limbs. Slowly, as if being dragged from the depths of a long, dreamless sleep, Margaret's consciousness stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open. Blinding light flooded her vision, and her body felt like lead. She struggled to breathe, her throat dry, her muscles stiff from months of disuse. Her brain felt sluggish, as if her thoughts were swimming through molasses. Where was she? She turned her head slightly. Machines surrounded her, their rhythmic beeps filling the sterile hospital room. The air smelled of disinfectant and something metallic. A hospital. Then, it all came rushing back. The sharp pain in her head, the dizziness, the fall, the stroke. She had survived. But how long had she been gone? Margaret's eyes roamed the room, searching for Richard. A blurry figure sat in the chair beside her, slumped over in sleep. Richard. Tears welled in her eyes. He had stayed. He hadn't abandoned her. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw, her voice barely a whisper. The effort sent a sharp pain through her body. As she shifted slightly, her breathing changed just enough to wake him. Richard stirred, blinking himself awake. When his gaze met hers, his face drained of color. "Margaret!" His voice cracked. "Oh my God!" She tried to smile, but something in his expression unsettled her. Instead of pure joy, there was something else lurking beneath the surface: shock, guilt. Margaret didn't understand why, not yet. A nurse rushed in, her voice warm but professional. "Mrs. Calloway, you're awake. This is incredible. We didn't know if you would ever regain consciousness." Margaret turned her head slightly to look at the nurse. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. Her name tag read Linda Preston. And then she saw it. The way Linda placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. The way he tensed but didn't pull away. The familiarity in her touch. Margaret's fingers twitched against the bedsheet. Something was wrong. Over the next few days, Margaret focused on her recovery, though her mind was consumed with doubt. Richard was different. He smiled, he held her hand, but it all felt forced. There was an unease in his touch, a nervousness in his words. And Linda, she was always nearby, always watching. Margaret pretended to be weak, struggling more than she needed to, just to observe them longer. And with each passing day, the pieces fell into place. The long, secret glances, the way Linda touched Richard when she thought no one was looking, the hushed conversations in the hallway. Margaret's body was weak, but her mind was sharper than ever. And now she knew the truth. Her loving husband, the man who had promised to stand by her in sickness and in health, had betrayed her with the very woman assigned to care for her. A slow, burning rage ignited within her. She had spent months in darkness, helpless and unaware. But now she was awake, and she would not be helpless anymore. Margaret Calloway had always been a patient woman. She had spent her life believing in love, in trust, in the kind of loyalty that lasted a lifetime. But as she lay in that hospital bed, pretending to be weaker than she truly was, she realized something terrifying. Richard had never truly been loyal. He had abandoned her before she had even left this earth. Margaret spent the next few days carefully observing, gathering every bit of evidence she could without saying a word. She noticed the way Linda's hand would linger on Richard's, how he would flinch when Margaret's gaze landed on them, the way he avoided her eyes when he thought she might be strong enough to ask questions. She wasn't ready to confront them, not yet. No, Margaret knew she had to be smart. The doctors were amazed by her progress. "Mrs. Calloway, I have to say, you're making an incredible recovery. It's rare for patients in comas for this long to regain so much mobility so quickly." Margaret smiled weakly, pretending to be grateful. But deep inside, she knew the truth. This wasn't just recovery. This was preparation. She worked hard during therapy, pushing herself further each day. The sooner she could regain her strength, the sooner she could do what needed to be done. Richard encouraged her, acting the part of the devoted husband. But every time he kissed her forehead, Margaret had to resist the urge to recoil. Every time he whispered, "I love you," she had to keep from screaming, because she knew his love was a lie. At night, when she was left alone in her hospital room, she thought about how she would make him pay. She had given him everything. Decades of her life, unwavering love, and the promise that she would always be by his side. And what had he done? He had thrown it away the moment she couldn't fight back. Margaret wasn't just going to take her life back. She was going to end his. One afternoon, as Linda came in to check her vitals, Margaret decided to push her limits. "Nurse Preston," Margaret said softly, her voice still hoarse from disuse. Linda looked startled, as if she hadn't expected Margaret to speak to her directly. "Yes, Mrs. Calloway? Do you need something?" Margaret smiled weakly. "You've been so kind to my husband during all of this. I can't tell you how much it means to me that he's had someone to lean on." A flicker of something, guilt, hesitation, crossed Linda's face. "Of course, we all just want to make sure you're getting the best care." Margaret reached out, shakily grasping Linda's hand. She squeezed it gently, looking deep into her eyes. You must know so much about Richard by now. He's a wonderful man, isn't he? Linda swallowed, pulling her hand away. Yes, yes, he is. Margaret saw the lie in her eyes. She was weak now, but soon she wouldn't be. And when that day came, Linda Preston wouldn't be the only one forced to face the truth. Because Margaret wasn't just planning to confront them. She was planning to destroy them. Margaret Calloway had spent her entire life as a loving, faithful wife. But as she lay in that hospital bed, regaining her strength in silence, she understood something clearly. Love had made her blind, but betrayal had given her sight. She wasn't the same woman Richard had married. She wasn't the same woman who had suffered a stroke and fallen into a coma. That woman had died the moment she realized the man she had loved for 40 years had replaced her with another. Now only vengeance remained. The hospital was quiet at night. The nurses changed shifts. The halls emptied. And only the steady beeping of machines filled the air. Margaret waited. She had been pretending to sleep when Richard and Linda thought they were alone. She had heard the hushed voices, the stolen moments they thought no one would notice. And now, she listened as Richard's footsteps echoed down the corridor. Margaret knew exactly where he was going. Linda's office. She gritted her teeth. They didn't even have the decency to hide it anymore. With slow, calculated movements, Margaret reached for the small notepad she had stolen from the nurse's station. With her hands still weak, the writing was sloppy, but the message was clear. I know what you did. She ripped the page from the pad and set it on the side table next to her hospital bed, making sure Richard would see it when he returned. Then, she closed her eyes and waited. Richard came back an hour later. Margaret heard him before she saw him, the way his breath hitched as he entered the room, the nervous shuffle of his feet. He hesitated near the door, then stepped inside, likely assuming she was still asleep. And then he saw the note. The sharp intake of breath told Margaret everything. She cracked her eyes open just enough to see his face, and for the first time since she had woken up, she felt satisfaction. Richard's hands trembled as he picked up the paper. His eyes darted to her motionless form, panic flooding his expression. Margaret remained still, letting him believe he was safe, letting him wonder. He crumpled the note in his hand, stuffing it into his pocket as if that could erase the truth. Then he sat beside her, forcing a shaky smile. Margaret, you're getting stronger every day. The doctors are so amazed by you. She wanted to laugh at the irony. Yes, she was getting stronger. And soon, he would regret every moment of her recovery. Richard smoothed her blanket over her lap, his fingers tightening around the fabric. Everything's going to be just fine, he whispered. Margaret's lips twitched. No, Richard. Everything's just beginning. Richard Calloway had always been a man who thrived on control. He built a life of comfort, stability, and predictability. That was why he had never expected Margaret to wake up. And now she had. The note had rattled him. Margaret could see it in the way his hands fidgeted, how he barely met her eyes anymore. He thought she was weak, fragile, but she was watching. She was waiting, and soon she would strike. Linda Preston wasn't as composed as Richard. Unlike him, she had never learned to hide guilt well. The moment she entered Margaret's hospital room the next morning, her usual calm demeanor was gone. How are we feeling today, Mrs. Calloway? Linda's voice cracked slightly as she checked Margaret's for. Margaret smiled sweetly. Better. I think I'll be out of here sooner than expected. Linda's face paled. That's wonderful. Margaret watched the woman's fingers tremble slightly as she adjusted the monitors. Good. Let her be afraid. Then, just as Linda turned to leave, Margaret spoke again. I had the strangest dream last night, she mused. I dreamt that my husband wasn't alone during my coma, that someone was taking care of him, in ways a wife should. Linda's body went rigid. Margaret let the silence stretch, relishing the way the nurse swallowed hard before forcing a nervous laugh. Coma dreams can be vivid, Linda said quickly. The brain can imagine all sorts of strange things. Margaret nodded, smiling. Yes, I suppose it can. Then, she leaned forward ever so slightly and whispered, but I don't think this was a dream. Linda's entire face drained of color. She practically bolted from the room. Margaret exhaled slowly, satisfied. That was the first crack in her armor. Soon she'd shatter completely. Now it was time to do the same to Richard. Richard had always been a man of routine. He arrived at the hospital in the morning, stayed for a few hours, then left for work. But Margaret had learned the truth. He wasn't going to the office. He was meeting Linda. Margaret had overheard the whispers, the hurried conversations in the hallway. They had planned to meet at a hotel that afternoon. She smiled to herself. Perfect. Margaret called her nurse, one of the younger, kinder ones, and feigned discomfort. I'd like to take a small walk today. The doctor said movement helps with my recovery. The nurse, unaware of Margaret's true intentions, agreed. So, for the first time in months, Margaret left her hospital room. She felt the cold air on her skin, the weight of her own body as she walked slowly to the elevator. Her bones ached, her muscles screamed in protest, but she ignored it. She had a mission. Margaret arrived at the hotel lobby, a scarf wrapped around her head to conceal her identity. She sat near the entrance, watching as Richard strolled in like a man without a care in the world. Then, Linda arrived moments later. They greeted each other with familiarity, their hands brushing in ways that made Margaret's blood boil. Richard leaned in and whispered something in Linda's ear. She giggled. Margaret gripped the arms of her chair so tightly that her nails dug into the fabric. She had imagined this moment in her head over and over again, but seeing it with her own eyes was different, more painful, more real. They walked toward the elevators together, their hands touching briefly. Margaret had seen enough. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and took several photos. Then she left. Margaret returned to the hospital before Richard even realized she was gone. That night, when he entered her room, she smiled at him warmly. You look happy, she said softly. Richard hesitated. I'm just relieved you're doing better. Margaret tilted her head. That's interesting. She reached under her blanket, pulled out her phone, and turned the screen toward him. The color drained from Richard's face as he saw the photos. Him and Linda together, walking into a hotel. Margaret's voice was like ice. You spent months waiting for me to die, didn't you? And when I didn't, you decided to enjoy your new life while I rotted away in this bed. Richard stammered, stepping back. Margaret, I can explain. She cut him off with a sharp laugh. No, Richard. I've done enough listening. Now you'll listen to me. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. It was time for the final act. The one where Richard Calloway finally learned what it felt like to lose everything. And she would make sure he never saw it coming. Margaret waited until the hospital was quiet. She had planned this carefully. The nurse assisting her that night was young, distracted. It was easy to slip something extra into her evening tea, a mild sedative. The nurse dozed off at her station, and Margaret silently unplugged her phone, ignoring the pain that shot through her arm. She grabbed the wheelchair by the door and carefully lowered herself into it. Then, she rolled out of the room and into the darkness. She knew exactly where Richard was. Richard had been staying in the guest wing of the hospital, using one of the unoccupied rooms to rest. Margaret rolled herself to his door, pushed it open, and saw him sleeping peacefully in bed. Her fingers tightened around the pillow she had brought. For a moment she hesitated. This was the man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her life. The man who had once held her hand and promised to love her forever. But that promise had been broken. And now so would he. Margaret moved swiftly, pressing the pillow over Richard's face with every ounce of strength she had left. He woke with a start, flailing, struggling, but she was stronger than he expected. His muffled screams filled the room, his body twisting beneath her grip. He clawed at her arms, but she didn't let go. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't stop. She pressed harder and harder until Richard Calloway stopped breathing. Margaret sat in the hospital chair, staring at Richard's lifeless body. She should have felt guilt, regret, but all she felt was peace. For the first time since waking up, Margaret felt truly alive. As the hospital alarm blared and nurses rushed in, she leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She was free, and Richard, he was exactly where he belonged.